Hey there, it's Alex. I want to do a special one today. I want to do this series in regards to reading certain chapters in regards to a book I found. It's called War in Heaven by Kyle Griffith. It's a spiritualist that I was sort of found out about by listening to certain kind of spiritualist content, and some of the ideas that it presents in here is sort of up my alley. I really dig the sort of look that he has, that there's certain kind of beings out there and astral existences that might be more nefarious in nature than previously assumed. But that I also like, though, that there is mention in regards to those certain psychic communities, that there is a certain kind of enlightenment regarding. I do want to say that I think that there is certain beings in the astral planes that are good, moral and just. But nonetheless, I mean, sort of upon my process and some of the things that have happened in the interaction regarding, I kind of felt it interesting to sort of read a certain kind of content that kind of knocked at the same sort of door that I was kind of arriving at. Because I think that there is a smaller portion of this physical earth-based spiritualist community, well, physical earth-based spiritual communities that have arrived to similar conclusions, that there is, negative spirits that exist in different ways. Um, is this recording? I think it's recording. Regardless, I think I'm gonna read the foreword, and then I'm gonna read the chapter. I think chapter one, part one, a breakthrough in spiritual consciousness. Chapter one, the search for spiritual reality. And then I'm just gonna read the foreword first. So War in Heaven introduces a completely new and revolutionary conception of the nature of spiritual reality. The material in it was dictated to me by automatic writing. Again, I am reading from the book itself, so this is from the perspective of Kyle Griffith. Uh, Continuing on, but WIH contains more explicit, detailed spiritual information than most modern channel books, and it is much more militant and controversial in tone. Some readers of the pre-publication edition of War in Heaven were disturbed or frightened by it, and a few attacked the book as evil and satanic. However, a large number of readers hailed it as a major breakthrough in cosmological theory. War in Heaven is not a typical New Age channeled book, and I'm not a typical New Ager, though I helped to found that movement in the 60s and 70s. I was raised as a traditional occultist, and my primary goal in life has always been to develop my skills as a psychic and magician. However, I also possess past life memories, and that have caused me to develop into a very different kind of occultist from my relatives who were Freemasons, Rosicrucians, spiritualists, or Theosophists. I've been aware since 1946, when I was 4 years old, that my soul is deliberately sent to this planet by an advanced extraterrestrial civilization to assist Earth people in dealing with a major crisis in their spiritual evolution. For this reason, I've studied UFOs and related subjects as seriously as I've studied a psychic and spiritual phenomenon, and the relationship between the two has always been obvious to me. The same applies to conspiracy theories. I've known all my life that unseen forces really do manipulate the course of human history, and my response has not been fear or anger, but rather a desire to help any of these agencies whose ethical and political goals seem similar to mine. I've been a left-wing anarchist and a member of the counterculture since the late 50s, and I've grown more politically and socially radical with age. In the late 60s, my spirit guide suggested I call myself a spiritual revolutionary, and I've been doing so ever since. However, I didn't become fully conscious of what the term meant until 1983, when I made a breakthrough in personal awareness about spiritual reality. In July of that year, after several years of intensive magical and intellectual preparation, I asked my spirit guides, tell me the great secret, the theory that explains the true nature of gods and human beings and the relationship between them. The reply that I received by automatic writing didn't surprise me, but I was absolutely astonished by it just the same. The spirits seemed to be trying to dictate a completely new and revolutionary cosmology, a view of spiritual reality with moral, social, and political implications that most people would consider literally unthinkable. I eventually became able to record the messages in clear and explicit English. It took me over 5 years and thousands of hours of grueling labor to receive all the spiritual dictated information in War in Heaven and write it into a book. The review on the next page will give you an idea of what WIH is about and why I'm advertising it as the most controversial channel book of the century. Review and comments. Mike Reiner review. Here's an excerpt from Mike Reiner's review of War in Heaven in the February 1989 issue of Critique. I wasn't even born then. I was born in 1991. War in Heaven is based on messages channeled from a group of extraterrestrial disembodied spirits who call themselves the Invisible College. They say that your soul is nourished on psychic energy generated during life, and when you die, it lives off the energy stored up during embodiment. There are also spiritual beings that the Invisible College call the theocrats, the bad guys who do not reincarnate, but instead get the energy needed to sustain their souls by sucking the energy from other souls, psychic vampirism and spiritual cannibalism. The theocrats are the creators of certain forms of organized religion which claim that you will have eternal life in heaven when you pass over. They create an illusion of this heaven in your mind by posing as gods, meanwhile giving you the after-death state that you expect. Whether it is a heaven or hell or an eternal orgy, for instance, if you expect to go to rock and roll heaven and worship at the feet of Elvis Presley or Jimi Hendrix, they will create this illusion for you. However, there are techniques you can use to avoid theocratic entanglement after death, which are described in War in Heaven. Before I read War in Heaven, the more I studied various spiritual systems, the more disillusioned I became. My main path has been in theosophy and its descendants, and the study of channeled spirits of all kinds, particularly those from Ascended Masters and Space Brothers. Each book I read in these fields claimed to teach the work of highly evolved beings, yet each contained glaring contradictions of others. Then I read War in Heaven and found out why these contradictions occur. The authors don't have an adequate theoretical frame of reference to correctly interpret the message they channel, even though much of the raw information is perfectly valid. War in Heaven contains a revolutionary yet completely logical cosmology which provides such a frame of reference and has answered questions that couldn't be answered by any other spiritual system that I studied. Reading it did cause more questions to crop up in my mind, but most of them are answered by the time I finished the book. The author says that the purpose of War in Heaven is to help readers make a major breakthrough in consciousness, and after reading it, I know what he means. It may well be the most important book ever published. Colin Wilson comment. The following is from a letter by Colin Wilson dated February 15th, 1989. War in Heaven arrived while I was in California last year, and when I got back, I had so many letters to write that I didn't have a chance to read it properly. I've just done so and find it an absolutely absorbing and fascinating piece of work. If I had received it 15 years ago, not long after I'd written The Occult, I would have thought that it was all wildly imaginative. But since then, I have learned a great deal more about this whole field of the paranormal, and a lot of what you say seems to me to make a great deal of sense. Anyway, very many thanks indeed for your kindness in sending me this extraordinary piece of work. Jay Kinney review, and here is an excerpt from a review by Jay Kinney that was included in the preface of the first printing of WIH in 1988. It originally appeared in Gnosis number 6 and was written about the pre-publication edition of the book, which was circulated in 1987 under the title of Spiritual Revolution, but it describes War in Heaven equally well. This self-published book is among the most fascinating and most troubling books I've read in some time. It is fascinating because it consists of channeled, example, automatic written material that it is not only clear and pointed, but also flies in the face almost all other channeled teachings. And it's troubling because to take Spiritual Revolution SR seriously entails entering into a topsy-turvy worldview that most of us would normally consider to be highly paranoid. Briefly put, the material in SR claims to emanate from a group of disembodied spirits informally called the Invisible College. As one might guess from its name, this group says it was the force behind the development of groups such as the Freemasons and Rosicrucians. More surprising, however, is its claim to also have influenced the rise of the civil rights movement, the spread of LSD, the anti-war movement, and even rock and roll. So far, so good. If this were all, one could peg the Invisible College as the hippiest bunch of interplane guides around, whispering bright ideas in the ears of the unsuspecting. However, there's more. The group is apparently engaged in an ongoing struggle against another powerful conglomeration of inner plane spirits it calls the theocrats. These types are apparently the ones behind the most world religions, and in fact hang around churches and other places of worship, soaking up the psychic energy that devout believers beam their way in prayer. These fiends are fond of meeting the newly deceased as they reach the other side and ushering them into an illusory heaven where their souls are gobbled up by the top theocrats. In other words, according to SR spiritual traditions which teach love of God, and ultimately union with the divine are really scams run by the inner plane theocrats to rip off psychic energy and souls. SR spells all this out in far more detail than I have space for here, considering that most channeled messages sound like their spirit authors have been cribbing from each other's notes. SR's revelations about a war in heaven stand out as decidedly unique. Spiritual Revolution is a startling book that makes one re-examine all of one's spiritual assumptions, considering that SR's thesis undercuts the spiritual moorings of world civilization. There ought to be some heated discussions to come. Table of contents. Forward, page 2. I'm not even going to read the pages, but I'll just read... So part 1, a breakthrough in spiritual consciousness, chapter 1, the search for spiritual reality, page 6. I'm just going to read just when I do these videos, I think I'll go through it. I'm going to just read chapter 2 and the page and that sort of thing. So I'm going to read the chapter 1, and you should go through it. Well, yeah, I can go through it right now. I think that some of the things that they talked about, at least in the review section, and before I read chapter 1 here, I'll go through the forward, I guess. What they sort of refer to is, I kind of want to address the psychic energy, the sapping kind of thing. As a psychic, I have experienced different kinds of, I would say, psychic stealing, energy taken at times. Yeah, I think that there is psychic vampires that exist. I think that there is multiple overlapping dimensions, and I think that pertains to some of the overlapping dimensions that main spirit guides indicated. I don't think that that's all the overlap in regards to physical earth-based that main spirit guides indicated in others. I think that there is that sort of phenomenon going on, and I don't think that that's all in regards to just world religions. It might be based in regards to world religions and that sort of thing. But I think that there's other messages in regards to afterlife, in regards to earth-based faith and other kinds that is, beyond that too, in many different ways. It's not, I don't think that all religion and faith messages pertain. I think there's a portion that potentially, that there is that sort of thing. I kind of feel like there's psychic vampirism, not just in regards to earth-based religion, but in regards to others as well. They sort of focus the theocrats in regards to organized religion. I think that there's multiple kinds of groups that aren't necessarily nefarious in nature in regards to religion. Again, it's one of those things where the spirit realm works through earth-based faith and faith in certain kinds of ways. I think that it's multiple-fold. Some people say that negative. There's a lot of negative in regards to earth-based faith, but specifically early on, without a certain kind of faith emergence, I feel like we would have been worse off in a certain manner. I do see the scientific community's points in regards to it, because there might have been more of an emphasis in regards to science, and maybe that's partially why there's certain scientific communities nowadays, spiritually, in which are still weary of certain kinds of faith at times. There is the conflicts in regards to faith and science on this physical earth-based, and others, defined by spirit guides, in which there has been conflict at times. Faith didn't just, at times, there was that physical, there was certain kind of world religions in which Poach themselves at times, which speaks of inner conflict in regards to a certain kind as well. That sort of utilization of culture and society to harm one another. There's been schisms and things like that within certain sects that speaks of certain kind of spirits sometimes utilizing our culture against us in certain manners. Again, we go to certain kind of Christianity, and they would sit there and I think they'd be like, no, we want to stick together on this physical earth-based and earth-based to a certain extent. I think there is a large portion that was like, we're trying to stick together, and there's a percentage in which is outside influences trying to break apart the band. That's what's happening here. Jesus on drums, and that's the truth. But it's not just Christianity. There's other ones as well too, and I'm not as well read in regards to either of them to be true, but I really do feel that to be the case. That's what I've discerned, and from certain interaction within my process, that seems to be the case at times. But yeah, and I think that I do want to again emphasize that I think that, there is many different. Well, I don't know if there's many different, but there is different definitions in regards to astral planes and astral realms. In regards to myself, Alex James Sissop, and others from Spirit Guides, I consider the astral realms what from main Spirit Guides negated in the moments that main Spirit Guides negated, the way main Spirit Guides negated. I and others from Spirit Guides consider the astral realms and astral planes that from main Spirit Guides negated to be what main Spirit Guides negated, the moments that main Spirit Guides negated, the way Spirit Guides negated. And yeah, but I've discerned from my end. There's different definitions in regards to it. Maybe I'll explain it later on. And I think that it can be unfair in regards to certain kind of psychic activity, certain kind of psychic interaction. You'll have a psychic who might have a negative experiences throughout his life, thinking that it's of a certain realm, in which it might not necessarily be of. Again, I can see how that can happen. I notice certain spiritual mechanisms. If I equate certain kind of trust mechanisms to trust realms, and that if I base that to be an interaction that's happening to me in regards to the channel, in regards to things like that, I can see how some of the negative experiences that I have, if I didn't have a certain kind of awareness or open-mindedness to be able to look past certain things and say, hey, this might not necessarily be trust realms that's happening, and I did and looked past it. I'm like, yeah, it's not trust realms to a certain extent. It's being utilized as an example. I'm not looking for them to be blamed at all. I'm not even trust realms to be protected, which guys negated. With that being said, I can still see how certain psychics would be like, okay, if there's an emphasis in regards to a certain spiritual mechanism, and I start labeling certain realms in regards to that sort of mechanism, and then start to base some of my communications in regards to that sort of stuff, if there's negative experiences, all of a sudden that sort of assumption and thought process that, hey, this realm that I've sort of been potentially interacting with, the negative experiences regarding it makes a certain kind of mindset that's not necessarily true, because you could be interacting with multiple different kinds of realms in regards to the mechanisms, communication, and things of that nature, which that's sort of what I've identified is that that there is a channel, there is interaction regarding multiple overlaps, dimensional overlaps at times, and it's one of those things that you could. If there's psychics out there that go a certain way on it, I can see how there's certain labelment in which might not necessarily be the case. Again, the theocrats in regards to astral planes, that's sort of talking about it. It might not necessarily be solely in regards to what some consider the astral realms and the astral planes. The way I said again, astral is one of those ways you think about etheric realms. Well, it's another one of those terms that certain spiritualists and psychics throughout history have utilized. It's one of those ones that one of the main terms in regards to some of the spiritual behind the scenes, in regards to, you could have multiple psychics referring to etheric realms and astral realms, to different realms, in a certain context, in which I feel has taken place in regards to the psychic and spiritualist earth-based physical communities. I mean, Spirit Guides and others, I mean, Spirit Guides having multiple definitions in regards to certain terms, which upon certain kind of interaction can be a big deal. I mean, like I explained previously, it really can matter, and for what's acceptable, it doesn't have to matter in the way some of these guys negated, but yeah, nonetheless, it really does. Yeah, again, there is the this idea that it sort of knocks at the door of something totally different from what some people are saying. Again, I think there is communities out there within physical earth-based spiritualist communities and earth-based spiritualist communities, as well as others, that is saying that there is negative experiences to a certain extent. And I sort of saw it, and I'm like, I think in certain realms of existences that there is this sort of kind of, moving away and sort of like not looking at some of the negative experiences that are happening by way of not necessarily wanting to, tackle those questions or whatever that is. Maybe it's something that they don't want to talk about right now to a certain extent, because again, you look at most of the psychic communities, and it is enlightened experiences, a lot of enlightenment throughout writings in regards to that sort of stuff. What is it, 80% of physical earth-based writings, and that's enlightened to a certain extent. I mean, it's around there. That's a ballpark estimate, and that's actually near the percentage of what near-death experiences reporting enlightenment. So it was 80 to 20, something like that. 20% distressing NDEs. It's kind of similar. It's interesting that it have a similar kind of percentage. Considering the contrast in regards to the amount of positive experiences within near-death experiences, and that of the positive experiences in regards to the written word on physical earth-based spiritualist communities. There's probably another 10 to 20% though out there that does have written stuff in regards to certain kind of distressing events and interaction, things of that nature. My process, considering the kind of content I've put up, would be probably considered some of the content, not necessarily in written works, but definitely in regards to something else, filmed content, online, that sort of thing, etc. If I mean spirit guides. Oh yeah. Yeah, that the idea that I've had that sort of thing where there's power struggles in regards to certain kind of negative spirits and positive spirits, and it, it, it it's I think that probably is probably considered, although my interaction with the astral planes, again, upon finding this research, there was this crazy event that happened. I bring up certain dimensional existences, and all of a sudden there's an interaction that sometimes takes place, and it's this certain accord and pact that's in play that's like, he's supposed to interact with these over here, but then he brings up certain dimensional existence and that happens, and all of a sudden it's like, okay, so it's one of those. Is it a puzzle piece where it's like when you bring someone up, there's something that's supposed to happen? It's one of the, well, it is one of those to a certain extent for what's acceptable because it's being situated in a certain manner. Certain people didn't like the idea of me, sort of interacting with certain dimensional existences. So, that sort of hit in regards to that sort of stuff, we're just going to have to situate. So it's going to be more spread out potentially in a certain manner. The most channeled messages from spirits. What else? Yeah, it talks of why there might be contradictions within spiritualist writings, and that could be, having to do with if there is certain kind of negative entities out there trying to disrupt that sort of writing and things of that nature. I think that there is a portion in regards to it, but there's also that other one that says, multiple dimensional existences, multiple kinds of interactions. The psychics on this physical earth based and others from spirit guides conversing and interacting with different dimensional existences, but also the other aspects of those dimensional existences as well too in regards to some of them. So you could see how there would be different kinds of beliefs and faith systems in regards to the spirit that is impacted upon us, to a certain extent in regards to the writings that come about and stuff of that nature. That's how we felt about it. This was the case with us. I really dig when he reads, I'm going to read this first chapter here. So we all felt. Part 1, A Breakthrough in Spiritual Revolution. Chapter 1, The Search for Spiritual Reality. Again, I'm reading it, and it is from the perspective of Kyle Griffith, the author of A War in Heaven. It's also from the perspective of those that mean spirit guides indicate in regards to this market application, etc. Performance guides. If we're going to pull that literal bullshit, okay, excuse my language. Manners that means guides indicated. Manners that means spirit guides indicated. Alrighty then. Part 1 is called A Breakthrough in Spiritual Consciousness because it summarizes the evolution of my personal beliefs about the nature of spiritual reality over a period of about 20 years, from the 60s up until 1983, when I made the breakthrough that allowed me to receive and understand the chain of messages presented in parts 2 and 3 of A War in Heaven. I made this breakthrough not by learning facts about spiritual phenomenon on the intellectual level, but by achieving a state of awareness and open-mindedness that enabled me to receive what my main spirit guides were actually trying to communicate to me, rather than what my prejudiced and brainwashed conscious mind wanted to hear. It may be difficult for the majority of people who read this book to identify with the viewpoint from which I'm writing. My psychic experiences, beginning with my earliest memories from childhood, are just as real and important to me as any experiences in the physical world. I've been reading minds, communicating with spiritual beings, and practicing psychic healing literally all of my life. I believe in these things on exactly the same level as I believe in my ability to speak the English language, so it's not easy for me to communicate with people who do not instinctively realize that such things are real. Whenever I can, I give accounts of my personal psychic experiences to explain why I formed particular spiritual beliefs. Some readers of the preliminary version of this book, published in 1987 under the title of Spiritual Revolution, dismissed these narratives as lies and garbage. Others said things like it has the ring of truth to it, even though it contradicts almost every other spiritual book I've ever read. You'll just have to make up your own mind. All I'll say at this point is that We're in Heaven contains no deliberate lies, and I'm neither smart enough nor crazy enough to hallucinate it at all. I also want to make clear that I really don't care if readers say they accept or reject the theories in this book. My purpose is not to gain followers for a narrow ideology, but to assist certain people in making the same breakthrough I made if you're one of those people. One of these people, sorry. You may not even know it until long after you finish the book, and the ideas in it have penetrated deep in your subconscious. However, I will also offer evidence to convince the reader's conscious intellect that what I'm saying is scientifically true, whenever I can do so without interfering with my primary purpose, which is to present an extremely complex and revolutionary theory about spirituality. Let me start by explaining why I believe that there is sufficient empirical evidence to convince any truly open-minded person that telepathy, spiritual communication, spirit communication, reincarnation, and many other psychic and spiritual phenomenon actually exist. Colin Wilson, one of the most rational and pragmatic of the 20th century philosophers, has come to a similar conclusion, as shown by the following excerpt from his book, The Occult, 1971. It was not until 2 years ago, when I began the systematic research for this book, that I realized the remarkable consistency of the evidence for such matters as life after death, out-of-the-body experiences, astral projection, reincarnation. In a basic sense, my attitude remains unchanged. I still regard philosophy, the pursuit of reality through intuition aided by intellect, as being more relevant, more important than questions of the occult. The weighing of the evidence in this unsympathetic frame of mind has convinced me that the basic claims of occultism are true. It seems to me that the reality of life after death has been established beyond all reasonable doubt. I sympathize with the philosophers and scientists who regard it as emotional nonsense, because I'm temperamentally on their side, but I think they're closing their eyes to evidence that would convince them if it concerned the mating habits of albino rats or the behavior of alpha particles. Let's use the evidence in support of reincarnation as a starting point. There are thousands of past life memory cases on record, described in hundreds of different books. Some of them are undoubtedly hoaxes or have explanations other than reincarnation, but many more seem to have been proven valid with physical evidence. For example, young children have demonstrated the ability to speak a foreign language that their parents are sure they have never even heard in their present lifetime. Other subjects traveled to places where they said they had lived during a previous life, described objects they had hidden, and he then found them. Colin Wilson's The Case for Reincarnation, 1987, presents an impressive amount of this type of evidence in reincarnation. A New Horizon in Science, Religion, and Society, 1984, edited by Sylvia Cranston and Carey Williams, presents even more. In my opinion, these two books, all by themselves, contain sufficient empirical evidence to prove the validity of reincarnation beyond reasonable doubt to anyone with a truly open mind. On the basis of this kind of published evidence alone, and leaving my personal past memories out of it, I am as ready to argue with anyone who denies that reincarnation is a scientific proven fact as I am to dispute an assertion that the sun revolves around the earth. Although I've never talked to anyone who was able to verify his or her past life memories with hard physical evidence comparable to that described in the books, my conversations on this subject with hundreds of different people have still yielded some valuable information. I've talked to dozens whose past life memory accounts seem historically accurate. Without exception, these people said they had lived before in the quite recent past and had possessed conscious control over their psychic abilities. Some said they had been American Indians with shamanic training. Several had been Hindus skilled in yoga, and others recounted past lives as Chinese or Japanese students of the martial arts. The majority, however, had been ordinary Americans with low-level occult training in the Rosicrucians, the Theosophists, the spiritualist movement, etc. The more I talked to some of these people, the more evidence I found that their past life memories were genuine. They had learned difficult mechanical skills, complicated intellectual knowledge, or even a whole foreign language with an ease that mystified their teachers. Some of them also reported being criticized by their instructors for instinctively doing things in a manner that is now considered obsolete. But was standard practice 50 or 70 years ago. No single case of this type is a conclusive proof of reincarnation by itself. But hearing dozens of such accounts face to face is very impressive. I also once had a psychic experience that I feel is excellent first-hand evidence for reincarnation. It is especially valuable because it does not involve past life memories like most of the other evidence, but direct psychic observation of the reincarnation process. Here is how I describe it to one of my correspondents. I'll tell you why I personally believe in reincarnation absolutely and completely. I've seen it happen. I stood by the crib of a newborn baby and psychically observed high-level spirit guides approach and assist a soul in entering the infant's body. Before I got the same vibes I got from an ape in the zoo after the vibes of a human baby. Before I got the same vibes I get from an ape in the zoo after the vibes of a human baby. It was a very clear-cut psychic experience, and similar to a more common but sadder experience you may have had yourselves, being at the bedside of a dying person and psychically perceiving the soul depart from the body. That's the real reason I believe in reincarnation so strongly, and all the inferential evidence in books is pale beside it. Ironically, my own past life memories aren't of much use in providing proof of reincarnation. They're extremely vivid and occur to me frequently, both in dreams and as flashes of memory when I'm awake. But there's no way to verify them with factual evidence because they are not memories of a past life on Earth. The people in them, including me, are slightly different anatomically from Earth people, and the setting seems to be an advanced technological society much different from anything I've ever seen described in science fiction. The general impression is that the society lives underground or on a space station of some kind, not on the surface of a planet. The people seem to live entirely indoors in an endless series of interconnecting rooms, and the doors connecting them may be teleportation devices. There are almost no artifacts of any kind visible in most of the scenes, not even furniture. People just sit or recline in midair. Maybe it's done with anti-gravity technology. All the machines seem to be hidden away, and there are no physical control panels. Apparently, everyone is hooked up telepathically to an elaborate computer system, and people operate the equipment just by thinking. However, when someone does this, images of machines and control panels seem to appear in midair. I still have vivid memories of dreaming about such things when I was only 3 or 4 years old. When I put the childish picture memories and emotions into adult words, they go something like this. I dreamed that I was turning into a machine. No, not a mechanical man. I was a part of a big machine, like a factory. And it kept getting bigger and bigger, and I knew I was supposed to control it with my thoughts. But I just didn't know the right things to think. These flashes of memory have been very important to me all my life because they often contain instructions for controlling and using my psychic powers or other mental faculties that I have trouble accessing with my conscious mind alone. They are probably the single most significant factor that helped prepare me for the breakthrough in spiritual consciousness that led to the writing of this book. I've talked to a number of people who also seem to remember past lives on other worlds and read books on the subjects by Brad Steger, Ruth Montgomery, and others. Here's what George C. Andrews had to say about it in Extraterrestrials Among Us, 1986. The concept of reincarnation implies a latent ability to regress back to former lives, and thus to restore the long dormant far memory of experience and information accumulated during previous incarnations to a conscious awareness. A substantial number of those who have worked on activating this latent ability find that their past lives include incarnations as extraterrestrials. This occurs so persistently that it has become a commonly accepted belief among those engaged in such work that extraterrestrials from many different points of origin have incarnated on Earth during this crucial all-or-nothing climax of human history. Some of those who remember previous existences as extraterrestrials also became aware of specific missions they were born to carry out during the present terrestrial incarnation. Here's a summary of my beliefs about reincarnation prior to my breakthrough in 1983. First, most of the well-documented, really plausible past life memory accounts seem to involve a previous life that ended 50 years or less before the person's present incarnation. Some people claim they have lived dozens or hundreds of lives over many centuries, but I've never seen an account of this type that contains solid supporting evidence, such as intimate knowledge of the language spoken during the past life. My conclusion from the available evidence about reincarnation was that very few people remember more than the last of their past lives in enough detail to be useful, and that spirits don't stay on the astral planes for more than a few decades between earthly lives. Second, the evidence also suggested that only people who were practicing psychics in their last incarnation seem to have vivid conscious past life memories in this one. Practically every well-documented account of a past life that I've seen includes descriptions of conscious, psychic activity, telepathy, mediumship, prophetic visions, faith healing, divination, etc. The psychic activities may have been the result of deliberate training, or they may have been spontaneous, but they are always there. Third, reincarnation may not be as common as most reincarnationists assume. The Eastern religions teach that all human beings reincarnate after death, except a few of the most spiritually advanced, which pass to a higher plane of existence. Most Westerners who believe in reincarnation at all have also accepted the idea that it is a universal phenomenon. In fact, I used to believe this idea myself and sometimes used it in arguments with Christians. They would say, you only live once, and then you are judged and consigned to heaven or hell for eternity. But I would reply, no, we all live over and over again through reincarnation. When the soul reaches a high enough state of development, it may pass to a higher plane, but everyone else just keeps living life after life on Earth. This is a lot fairer than the systems are describing, because people always get a second chance. However, the more I learned about reincarnation as described in the strongest past life memory accounts, the less I came to believe that everybody who dies reincarnates. The only thing the evidence demonstrates clearly is that a few people, probably less than 1% of the population, remember a past life well enough to prove it. Many more, maybe a tenth to a quarter of the population, have some conscious past life memories that can be accessed by hypnotic regression or other techniques. Some New Agers claim that everybody can learn to remember past lives, but I've never felt they even come close to proving it. In the last few years, before I made my breakthrough, I admitted to myself that the available evidence wasn't adequate to determine what percentage of the population reincarnates or what happens to the souls of people who don't. I did sometimes speculate that having conscious control over their psychic powers might help people reincarnate, but I found this line of reasoning distasteful. In the absence of real evidence, it seemed elitist and self-serving, so I didn't pursue it. However, having an open mind on the subject prepared me to accept the truth when my spirit guides finally told it to me. Whether reincarnation is common or rare, accepting that it exists at all obliges one to start looking for the information about the soul. The entity that transfers from one body to another carry the past life memories, like the 19th century spiritualists and many other occultists. I postulated that the soul is composed of specialized forms of matter and energy presently unknown to physical science. This hypothesis is quite vague, of course, but it lays a foundation for finding out more about the nature of the soul by scientific methods of investigation. I will next discuss the evidence that some disembodied human souls are active and conscious on the astral planes and can communicate with the living by telepathy. There is even more evidence available in published literature to support this hypothesis than there is to support reincarnation. The organized spiritualist movement of the 19th and early 20th century produced enough spirit-dictated books to fill a small library, and the modern channeling movement is generating still more. I admit that some of these are either conscious hoaxes or creation of the author's own imagination, but I'm convinced that many are genuine communications from spirits. Because it's difficult to tell genuine channeled books from fakes and products of self-delusion, I recommended works based on scientific investigations of spiritualist and channeling movements. Such investigations often employ methods similar to those used by reincarnation researchers mentioned earlier. For example, a medium will obtain information from the spirit of a deceased person that no living person could know, and the investigator will try to verify it with empirical evidence. Most libraries contain a few books of this type, and I've read several hundred that each contain sufficient evidence to prove that the dead survive and communicate with the living. Cases where the spirits of a murder victim had passed enough information to a medium to identify and convict the killer are actually quite common. That's the thing of it. Hello. My PDF just closed. Just a second. Let me open it up. Okay, then. Okay, here we go. Let's go back to the place where it was. I don't know why. cases where the spirit of a murder victim has passed enough information to a medium to identify and convict the killer are actually quite common. This information often includes detailed instructions for locating physical evidence, weapons, clothing, and especially the body itself. Dozens of such cases are reported in the newspaper every year, and hundreds more are known within the occult community but kept quiet. This is especially true in small towns and rural areas where psychics routinely help the police solve crimes, and the cops quietly defend them from prosecution by religious fanatics. This fragile relationship depends on secrecy, so stories with headlines like "Psychic Locates Murder Weapon" don't appear in the papers as commonly as they should. If you start looking for cases like these in books, magazines, or newspaper files, you'll find the evidence extremely impressive. The same applies to cases where spirits told mediums the sites of treasures buried by deceased people, hidden wills, and other papers, etc. I feel there is sufficient evidence in any large library or bookstore to convince anyone who's reasonably unbiased of the reality of contact between the living and the spirits of the dead. If you do start reading to find such evidence, here's something else to look for at the same time. The spirits who pass information to mediums about events that happened, while they were very often seen to senile, childish, paranoid, or otherwise in distress, that it is difficult and painful for the medium to communicate with them. The authors of mediumistic literature often don't emphasize these negative details, but they are there if you look for them. Since the 19th century, spiritualists and other occultists who practice mediumship have deliberately concealed a lot of information about the spirit world when they write accounts of their communication with the dead. This is done with the best of motives to keep from frightening the public and to avoid giving support to fundamentalist charges that mediumship involves contact with demonic forces. Most literature still gives the reader a misleading impression of what it is actually like to receive messages from the spirit world at a seance by automatic writing or through mechanical aids such as the Ouija board. Did you ever wonder why practically all mediums communicate with the majority of spirits indirectly? Both the old-fashioned spiritualist mediums and the New Age channeling mediums have spirit guides who assist them in finding and communicating with other spirits, but very few are willing to tell you bluntly that they have to operate this way. The reason is very simple. Most spirits on the astral plane are in mental states that we'd label as insane or feeble-minded in a living person. They mumble in baby talk or rave like schizophrenics. Their thoughts ramble and get lost in time like those of a person with Alzheimer's disease. They contradict themselves as if their memories have been scrambled up with the contents of someone else's mind. And above all, they act sick, drunk, or drugged. Some say they're in severe pain. Others are frightened. Still, others are calm. But it's the sickly calm of a person who has taken a heavy dose of morphine or thorazine. If you experimented with Ouija boards, there's an excellent chance you've spoken to spirits in this condition. And though the mediumistic literature does mention frequently contacts with lost souls, earthbound spirits, entities from the lower astral, etc., it rarely describes them in detail or prevails. The vast majority of the medium's contact are in this category. The plain truth is that if you're going to accomplish anything at all as a medium, you have to work through a spirit guide. A spirit guide is simply a spirit on the astral plane with sufficient mental stability and psychic powers to communicate easily with a particular medium and who is willing to form a personal relationship. Another thing to look for between the lines of the literature, this relationship is often overtly sexual. Mediums' spirit guide often receives some of the energy raised during physical sexual activity. Only the Eastern tantric magicians and Western students of sex magic write and talk openly about this, but almost all mediums practice it. Explanation of exactly what all this means will be given in part 2. The rest of part 1 will describe other knowledge I had to learn before I can make the breakthrough. It goes to the chapter 2 after that. So I don't know if my video froze while I'm recording this. We'll see upon the conversion and uploading online. We'll see if it froze. I apologize greatly if the frame is frozen, but if it's not, then okay, that's great. But I'm actually going to go through it here and talk a bit about what I feel in regards to some of the stuff he's written about. Let's see. There is, I think, a big spiritual community that exists around Physical Earth-based that likes the analyzation and looking upon in a scientific frame of mind. There are those in the spirit that really care about that sort of thing. I mean, Colin Wilson kind of described it that he's still sort of temperamentally on the side of some who would consider certain kinds of psychic information to be not necessarily not necessarily what some I think are the weighing of evidence in this unsympathetic frame of mind has convinced me that the basic claims of occultism are true. It seems to me that the reality of life after death has been established beyond all reasonable doubt. I sympathize with the philosophers and scientists who are regarded as emotional nonsense because I'm temperamentally on their side. But so there is those who look at it from that perspective, but there's a certain lens when you like empirical evidence. The way Kyle Griffith writes is there is a scientific kind of lens flair to it, which is really awesome. And I think it does help a certain community behind the scenes get behind something. And I love that there's a large group of spiritualists that are okay in certain manners pertaining to some of it. Again, it was that sort of thing that I talked about actually yesterday in my process, where science and spirituality are, might be looking towards the same thing in a certain kind of manner. I mean, if you look at scientists studying, live dimensional, they're sort of taking a look at the cover of things, and it really is an important endeavor because it impacts our lives fairly, in a large degree. If you get hit by a car, the science as to why and how that works is important, partially for us to understand maybe we should be standing in the middle of a goddamn road. But it's one of those things that I really dig, and I think it's great. He had a psychic experience here that he listed as being able to see certain spirits enter a certain newborn to a certain extent. And I would sort of say, I mean, if that was something that happened to me in a psychic experience, maybe that was maybe a walk-in or something of that nature, because I've sort of discerned that there is different kind of passengers in regards to incarnation. In regards to some of us, that there's potentially multiple souls experiencing our life as we as we carry on through our lives, and the idea that maybe there would be that sort of thing where because I always assumed, I thought maybe that it was upon, I think there's multiple moments within the pregnancy process where there's spirits potentially incarnating in a certain manner. And I think birth's one of them, a certain kind of moments, a certain kind of amount of time with, a certain baby in the womb, that where there's, incarnation happening to a certain extent, and to sort of have it, upon when, certain physicals are childlike and small in babies is interesting too. But there is things like that. I mean, psychic flashes and sight of that does sort of speak of different kind of theories to a certain extent. And I found the past life memories that he speaks of are quite interesting as well, almost like a certain kind of civilization that is utilizing technology in an advanced form, that they might be connected to another kind of dimensional existence through the connection of certain kinds of dimensional hookups to a certain extent. I'm wondering if that is in the physical or if that's in another dimensional existence. It'd be interesting if that is in the physical to a certain extent. I don't know what that sort of knocks at, but it is one of those things where it's a different kind of different kind of society. But one of the things I love about it is that you can potentially, it's one of the things that he describes in here. Let me go to the passage which he talks about in regards to seeing those memories. Yeah, all the machines seem to be hidden away, and there are no physical control panels. Apparently, everyone hooked up telepathically to an elaborate computer system, and people operate the equipment just by thinking. Yeah, this sort of thing, we potentially have hookups like this behind the scenes in regards to some of us. And the kind of things that we can do in the physical in regards to this might remain similar. We talk about thoughts and the power of thoughts. Within spiritualist writings, there is multiple kinds of thoughts. There's multiple kinds of writings in regards to the power of thought, that how it affects things, the ripple effect regarding it. So I'm wondering if, like, just like a certain kind of call word in the thoughts, a certain kind of passphrase, and all of a sudden you have access to a certain kind of thing. You know, that's one of those things. Like, behind the scenes, as a psychic, I felt spiritual mechanisms where we might be hooked up to this, even while hooked up to certain things behind the scenes, while living our physical lives to a certain extent, which we can impact from down here. Again, you bring up a certain kind of data pad, and one of the things he saw was someone bringing up a certain kind of control. Was it control panel? People operate the equipment just by thinking. And again, that this speaks of something. There's a deja vu moment in regards to myself here too. Yeah, one of those things where you know, as a psychic, I can feel like if you pull information from the light, that we can access the light from in the physical, from in the other dimensional, and that you can pull all manners of different information. And you know, I set call words up to certain kind of disclaimers that spirit guides fully defined in the light, the way spirit guides indicate in the light, and the utilization of that sort of methods, I think, is decent. It's a safety, but you know what, your main spirit guides information regarding, you know, your spiritual actions regarding a lot of us, you know, would take precedence, the way your main spirit guides indicating, and out there listening to this content, you know, that sort of thing. It's one of those things where you should still be able to do it without having to utilize certain call words. Just, you know, even without, you know, some people go way beyond that and said that, you know, we don't necessarily have to create certain disclaimers too, because it's already in play. It's been in play since whenever the heck it was. Some people look right to the beginning, where those original beings, that spirit guides indicate, put certain disclaimers into play to a certain extent, and just say, you know, I'm not going to, you know, how much energy and we have to utilize anyhow when we want to be conserving certain kinds of energy to a certain extent. And, you know, that sort of stuff that says, you know, you can pull information. I can feel it as a psychic. One of the things is pulling information from the setting around me. And so it's kind of interesting that that's just like a hookup with these memories, and the idea that you are potentially, some of us, hooked up to certain kinds of things that we can affect while we're in the dimensional life. Yeah, he also talked about reincarnation. However, before like 1983, however, he believed in this sort of thing, that maybe, you know, like we lived life after life. I think that there is reincarnation systems, incarnation systems like that. And I think that some people equate that to certain karmic systems too, because there is a talk of dharma and karma, you know, in regards to some of those systems where we live life after life. And there is some animals, spirit guides indicated, that want to be going to the afterlife. That spirit guides indicated, the way guys indicated. I'm just gonna throw that out there. But yeah, regardless, because some have spoken, you know, in regards to communication, that some of the animals on this physical earth-based have at times throughout earth-based history, some of them been hooked up to certain kind of karmic systems in a certain manner. But I feel like there's aspects of those that spirit guides indicated that go towards the existences that spirit guides indicated. You know, it's interesting like that. And but yeah, one of the things I think he kind of got right on it when he started realizing, you know. However, the more I learned about reincarnation as described in the strongest past life memory accounts, the less I came to believe that everybody who dies reincarnates. I agree. I mean, this is, I sort of have that thought process, that not everybody reincarnates in a certain kind of cycle over and over again until a certain kind of measure is met. I think a certain kind of measure being met is in certain kinds of karmic systems. But I feel like for a large percentage of physical earth-based and others, spirit guides, it's going to a certain kind of light existence. That means spirit guides indicating light existences. That means spirit guides indicated the women, spirit guides indicated. But there's other ones too. Certain aspects might, you know, I think oftentimes when we think about the driver of the physical body, I think that person, those that means spirit guide, those people, those spirits that means spirit guides negated, oftentimes go to the light existences that means spirit guides negated, the way in which guides negated. But there's other aspects of ourselves. Again, we talk about passengers, incarnational passengers, that potentially go to a certain kind of darkness. And hey, this is the thing of it. Near-death experience research has described a lot of darkness that's seen not to be harmful to a certain extent. I mean, there is a lot of decent existences out there in regards to darkness to a certain extent. There is other ones that are, and I think that is the truth. There's ones out there that are, distressing and violent to a certain extent. But I feel like there is something to be said in regards to some of the near-death experiences that they do see, certain kinds of darker existences that are good. I mean, even the tunnel that we see, it's a dark tunnel, a black tunnel, right? And it shoehorns us into the light to a certain extent. What does that say? Oh, okay. Oh my, that's a big one. But yeah, that's a good one too. Yeah, they talked about a certain kind of relationship in regards to psychic detectives, things of that nature. I think that there's a bit of a turbulent in regards to certain kinds of media. I'm not even for what spirit guides indicated regarding, if need be, the range guys needed. It's one of those things where I think it is still decent, though, to give validity in regards to psychic detective work, because that's a big one. It's one of those things that if we have psychics on this physical earth based, and I do love the kind of just under the radar kind of blasé kind of, they exist, but it's, we're not necessarily, I feel like we're not necessarily utilizing them in the capacity that it could be. But I still do like that kind of just, it's there, it exists, and they are trying to help people. And I'm having for those abilities, I mean, spirit guides need to be protected. I mean, guys need. I think that Cover has done a great job in regards to a certain extent. And I do love, though, that it synergizes and contrasts with the spiritualist communities and where they're going with it. It's one of those slow-moving kind of things where in hundreds of years it might be utilized in that sort of way, where you have a psychic detective agency emerge to a certain extent. And not to say that it doesn't already emerge now, but in such ways where there's an awareness in regards to it, and a validity and vindication that emerges. It will happen, and it's already there. There's some that are already there in a certain manner. By way of personal, you take a look at certain personal evidence and what's happened and the good work that they've done. You take a look at those processes that people have been noting to a certain extent that main spirit guides indicated, and you can see that there is validity in that sort of work. That there is people being protected, and there is certain kind of justices being understood. And again, though, there is a percentage in regards to physical earth-based that means spirit guides negated that I feel are advocating for the punishment that means spirit guides negated to be what means spirit guides negated, the way means spirit guides negated. Those psychic mediums being labeled like they're somehow trying to get a more brimstone punishment than what seems than what is not necessarily the case. And yeah, so I mean, yeah, I think it's great that sort of thing in the Ouija boards. Again, the Ouija boards for me kind of speak of paranormal realms. I mean, again, there's overlapping dimensions, multiple overlapping dimensions. I think of paranormal when I think of Ouija, and I think that there are ones out there that are not necessarily, I think it can be different. I mean, when I think there is paranormal, there can be in regards to certain kind of automatic writing, but when I think of certain kind of psychic mechanisms, I think of a certain dimensional overlap regarding it. And I've had my experiences in regards to certain kind of paranormal at times. I've had some stuff happen here and there where where I look around like, holy smoke, this is like that. That's that stuff where like we start like, is our objects going to start flying around the house? I mean, is this what that's going to be? There's ones like that, and it is scary stuff to a certain extent. Well, that would be correct. And yeah, but really cool first chapter. I just wanted to see and kind of give my thoughts on it. This sort of thing right at the end in regards to certain kind of sexual energy. I don't think there's always an exchange in regards to sensual energy in regards to a certain guideship that means spirit guides indicated, but I think that there is, when intimacy is pursued, a certain kind of interaction that takes place that is spiritual. Again, this is one of those things where I've noticed that there is a certain kind of interaction, some of which might not necessarily be consented. So again, that's a big deal. It's a big one. If you're pursuing intimacy in a certain kind of way and a spirit kind of latches onto you to a certain extent, what is it, is that a consented thing? Well, there's that sort of thing where it's like in certain dimensional overlap. Some people are like, oh, well, it's just one of those, sort of things. But is it? And it's a decent question, because it really does matter, especially if it's not. And, regardless, what does that mean? If it is that's just sort of this passing spirit sort of thing, then hey, what's this? Let's go over here and put some spirits that mean spirit guides indicated from the original light in the areas that mean spirit guides indicated. It's just this sort of like, passing through kind of thing, just to at least protect in regards to certain kind of beings like that, or also set up certain kind of content experiences for those who want to be able to pursue that kind of intimacy within those realms in a certain kind of manner. I think it would be a good idea to a certain extent. Now, that was what you did. Spirit guide, spirit guides. Yeah, I've had my, I've had my thing with certain spirit guide ships and things of that nature. I think in certain systems, they're trying to help you, but in a certain fashion. Not necessarily, you don't necessarily want to be knocking at certain doors in regards to some of them, but some of them, operate a certain fashion, and it depends on where you go. It depends on who you are. It depends on how you operate. If you start doing certain kind of works, it might go over to something else. So it really does matter on the case itself, on the person itself, on family, a bunch of different factors regarding some of them. But there are those out there that I'm open for resources regarding ways that means guys that are trying to help within the confines of trying to do it within the frameworks that exist. I mean, one of the things that this book talks about is that sort of, again, the theocrats, that sort of thing where there's certain kind of baddies and stuff of that nature. And, I've certainly talked about certain kind of immorality emergence and stuff like that. Specifically within the form of, governmental and that sort of thing that exists to a certain extent. And I don't want that necessarily to impact certain things to a certain degree, because that's certainly not what we want to necessarily have happen. But yeah, I mean, it exists, I think, to a certain extent, and I think that this theocrat is potentially a part of it, if not in reference to some of it that main spirit guides indicated, and maybe not at all. I mean, that's the truth of it. This is the case list. I'm adding for the information that main spirit guides indicated in regards to this market application extension departments or guides to be displayed. Where guys negative, where guys negative. Anyway, that's chapter 1 of War in Heaven. I apologize if there is a frozen frame. I don't mean to upset. It's just something that happened. I'm just kind of sitting there like, what? Like, I don't know. Well, there we go.